Hello, we are beginning our conversation about Toni Morrison's Beloved, one of the great American novels, and Morrison is one of the great American authors. So I'm really excited to be reading this with you. And a couple of questions that I have to start us off today is, first of all, how does Beloved reimagine Gothic space? So we've read Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto. We watched Guillermo del Toro's El Fauno del Labirinto. And now we are reading an entirely different narrative. And I want us to think about 124, that is the house where Setha and Denver and Beloved live, as another kind of Gothic space that has its own repressed history and that has its own sort of forms of haunting. So I want us to think about what this novel is doing with Gothic space that is different from what we've seen so far. I want us also to think about how Morrison rewrites the Gothic tradition that we're exploring in this class. Now, granted, we've only read one of the traditional British Gothic novels, but we'll also be reading others during the course of the semester. We're also going to be thinking about how Morrison rewrites the slave narrative tradition. I'm going to be talking a little bit about that today in my presentation. So let's hold these questions with us throughout our reading of Beloved together. This is the last text that we will be covering in our first unit on the repressed histories of Gothic spaces, and we might think about what repressed histories are contained in the House 124 as we read along. So I want to give some background on the slave narrative tradition. What is a slave narrative? I'm going to talk about that now. What are the characteristics of the slave narrative? Now, these were 18th and 19th century first-hand accounts of persons, of black persons who had, I was going to say African-American persons, but also this includes persons who were not born in America, but black persons who had escaped enslavement, who had gained their own manumission from enslavement, and these were written in the 18th and 19th century, and their purpose was to represent a personal story that was also meant to be indicative of all enslaved black persons. So it was meant to be a kind of archetypal representation of the horrors of slavery. And even those horrors are sometimes held back a little bit. The purpose was to persuade white readers to join in the abolitionist movement to outlaw slavery. So that was kind of some of the characteristics. These were praised for being objective and not too inflammatory. So there was a really difficult tightrope that the authors of these accounts had to walk. They couldn't be too inflammatory. They had to maintain or appear to white readers to maintain an objective stance. And of course, this is something that white people today still have issues with, right? Is the idea that a black person relating a story about their own oppression might not be objective. But this is also has historical precedence when we turn to the slave narrative tradition that Morrison is rewriting. So some graphic detail would be allowed, but not too much. So the horrors of slavery are depicted in the slave narrative, but they had to be restricted to the point where it wouldn't be too inflammatory, where it wouldn't overwhelm the reader to the extent that they would put the book down, right? Again, the purpose was to persuade white readers of the horrors of slavery, but it had to be done to a certain degree. It was also written in the sentimental tradition. This is an 18th century tradition, at least in Britain. The sentimental tradition is one in which there's an emphasis on feeling, there's an emphasis on emotion. We think of sentimentality today as being overwrought sometimes, but in the 18th century it was very much in mode to appeal to the sentiments. Here's an example of from one of the 18th century, one of the great 18th century slave narratives, Lauda Equiano's interesting narrative of the life of Equiano. And in this quote, we can see how he appeals to white readers' sentiment and how he appeals to their religious values. So the quote reads as follows, and here he is in a slave ship. Equiano is hearkening back to his days of being an enslaved person. He writes, I remember in the vessel in which I was brought over in the men's apartment, there were several brothers who in the sale were sold in different lots. And it was very moving on this occasion to see and hear their cries at parting. O ye nominal Christians, might not an African ask you, learned you this from your God, who says unto you, do unto all men as you would men should do unto you. So notice that there isn't too much of an emphasis on the graphic detail of what the slave sale would have been like. Being on the auction block, we know from historical records, was a horrifying scene. But here Equiano focuses on the separation of brothers from each other and their cries, and then he appeals to white readers' religious values. O ye nominal Christians, right? Do unto others as you would men should do unto you. So appealing to their religious values, he hopes to instill the wrongdoings of chattel slavery. So I want to talk a little bit about the neo-slave narrative, and neo means new. So this would be a newer form of the slave narrative, which Morrison's Beloved participates in. From after World War II onward, the neo-slave narrative describes slave narratives that examine the horrors of enslavement from a first-person perspective. And Morrison writes, this is a quote from Toni Morrison, for me, a contemporary writer who is black and a woman, my job becomes how to rip that veil drawn over proceedings too terrible to relate. So whereas in the original slave narrative tradition, there couldn't be too much graphic detail, Morrison wants to rip the veil off of that and show the horrors of enslavement. And so that is what the tradition that Beloved is participating in. And Morrison feels it's her calling as a black woman to rip that veil off and to show some of the graphic detail that was not allowed in 18th and 19th century accounts. Morrison also says that she relies on memories within and the power of the imagination. So one thing to keep in mind is that the brutality and horrors of slavery and the various traumas faced by Black Americans, those get and horrors which continue in various forms today, right? These get passed down intergenerationally, so that Morrison, as a writer who passed away a few years ago, FYI, but writing in the 20th century after the ending of slavery, Morrison wants to rely on her own sort of rememory and her own, what she calls rememory, and her own imagination to reveal, to convey the narrative of exploitation faced by her own ancestors. And she also wants to give interior life to characters who were denied it in the slave narrative, right? So she focuses in particular on black girls and black women. You'll notice that 124 is a house that is populated by black girls and black women and a ghost who is a black infant girl. So her purpose here is to give interior life, to really show what the experience of being black and being a woman or girl is in this tradition in which they were often denied that interiority. And so she also writes for black women in particular, and we can ask ourselves what that means. It doesn't mean that I can't read it as a white man. It just means that I was not her intended audience. And so we can actually think about what that means. And like for me personally, I'm grateful that I have access to this novel, but I also recognize that it was not written for me. These questions of audience, I think, are really important to keep in mind. Starting off, I just want to read a few passages that you can follow along with in your own novel. But just from the very beginning, the very first paragraph, we can see Morrison's brilliance as she narrates the beginning of her novel here. 124 was spiteful, full of a baby's venom. The women in the house knew it, and so did the children. For years, each pop up with a spite in his own way, but by 1873, Setha and her daughter Denver were its only victims. The grandmother, Baby Suggs, was dead, and the sons, Howard and Bugler, had run away by the time they were 13 years old. As soon as merely looking in a mirror shattered it. That was the signal for Bugler. As soon as 2 tiny handprints appeared in the cake, that was it for Howard. Neither boy waited to see more. So this is a house that is haunted. It's haunted by Beloved, who is a black infant girl. And it is a house that is matriarchal. It is a house that the boys abandon because they're fearful of what is shown there in their deceased little sister. So from the description of the house, right, we move to the familial impossibility, to the impossibility of a nuclear family in the context of Reconstruction, how slavery divided black families and how it ripped them apart, how awful it was in terms of just not only slave sales dividing families, but torture, murder, the lynchings that continued into the Reconstruction period. And one thing that Beloved, this novel, explores is how fraught the nuclear family is, how impossible it is for black persons living in the era of Reconstruction. So that tension really helps to drive the plot, and we can think back to the Castle of Otranto, right, and the way in which that novel also poses the nuclear family as a site of tension, and in some ways as the site of terror. But here, that terror is not just about patriarchy as it is in the Castle of Otranto. Obviously, in this novel, the catalyst of the terror is white supremacy and chattel slavery and Reconstruction, and sort of the experience of black persons living within these systems that are hostile to their very existence. So on page 4, we can look to page 4, Baby Suggs on her bed, right, on her deathbed. She's really kind of hovering between two worlds, not quite alive, not quite dead. She's in a liminal stage. This is highly symbolic of the experience of African Americans during Reconstruction. We also have a description of Sweet Home, which is the plantation in which Setha and Baby Suggs had been enslaved 18 years prior to the present tense. So the sweet home is described here on page 7. The plash of water, the sight of her shoes and stockings awry on the path where she had flung them, or here boy lapping in the puddle near her feet, and suddenly there was Sweet Home rolling out before her eyes. And although there was not a leaf on that farm that did not make her want to scream, it rolled itself out before her in shameless beauty. It never looked as terrible as it was, and it made her wonder if hell was a pretty place too. So we have these descriptions of the homes in which um, Setha has been previously had been enslaved, and the one in which she now lives in the outskirts of Cincinnati. Um, we also get depiction of her daughter, her only remaining child that is still with her, Denver, as lonely, right? Why would she be lonely in this haunted house where she actually has a connection with her deceased sister? But on page 14 and 15, bottom of 14, hot, shy, now Denver was lonely. All that leaving, first her brothers, then her grandmother, serious losses since there were no children willing to circle her in a game or hang by their knees from her porch railing. None of that mattered as long as her mother did not look away as she was doing now, making Denver long, downright long, for a sign of spite from the baby's ghost. So Denver is lonely, and the ghost of her sister, though terrifying to outsiders, brings her comfort because it's one of the few connections that she has. Again, Morrison is ripping off the veil of things too terrible to relate. And here we are getting firsthand interiority into the experience of Black girls during the era of Reconstruction. Also on page 21 and 22, right, we have the return of Paul D. To Setha. They had known each other at Sweet Home. Paul D. and Setha have sex. And on page 22, right after that, Paul D. pushes Beloved out of the house. Top of 22, God damn it, hush up, Paul D. was shouting, falling, reaching for anchor. Leave the place alone, get the hell out. A table rushed toward him and he grabbed its leg. Somehow he managed to stand at an angle and, holding the table by two legs, he bashed it out, wrecking everything, screaming back at the screaming house. You want to fight? Come on, goddammit. Paul D. is hostile to Beloved's ghost, and we can think about what that might mean in terms of his attempts to assert his own sort of patriarchal authority over the house, and how Beloved would be somewhat hostile to that. So there's a hostility there, and we're going to see how that plays out in our reading. We have blurred boundaries between the past and present. That should be, we've seen that in every text, including The Shining, right? We have a repressed history that's going to be unveiled as the narrative develops. What is the meaning of haunting, right? We can think about that. There's an example on page 14 and 15 that we can also look at. I'm so sorry, I already read that. Ignore that. Ignore that passage. But we can think about, again, haunting. What does Beloved's haunting of 124 mean? How does this mesh with the other narratives we have examined so far? So you might start to think generally about the overlaps and the distinctions between Pan's Labyrinth and Beloved, or the Castle of Otranto and Beloved. We also have the importance of storytelling and frame tales here, which you can look at on 69 and 84. I don't want to continue on for too much longer because I'm getting close to 20 minutes here, and I wanted to cut myself off at 20 minutes. But again, the impossibility of the nuclear family under the system of chattel slavery and Reconstruction. I'm going to stop here for now. You will have an assignment in the class chat. There will be a question there that I want you to address. And once you've, I'm sorry, no, not in the class chat. I believe we have a discussion post for today, which will be separate from the class chat. So finish your discussion post and have that posted by the end of Thursday at midnight after you watch this. And that will, by doing that, you will get credit for the discussion post and credit for attending this class. I hope you have a good long weekend. And remember, Monday, Michael Werner will be giving the guest lecture. If you have any questions, please reach out to me by email. I am available. I hope you are all well. Take care. And goodbye. Really dig into this novel as much as you can. It's really extraordinary, and I'm glad that we get to read it together. Okay, take care. Bye.